Hello and welcome to ITV News West Country. I'm Seb.
And I'm Claire. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Your headlines tonight. The Eastwood Park prison officer who repeatedly assaulted boys. Tonight, in an exclusive interview, we hear from one of his victims.
An absolute sadistic nutcase. If there was a 14-year-old kid crying his eyes out, he'd be screaming at them.
Good evening. First tonight, the victim of a former guard at the Eastwood Park Young Offenders Institute has described the feelings of terror he had while he was being beaten there during his time.
Former guard Patrick Devaney has been convicted of misconduct in a public office after Bristol Crown Court heard about a string of abuse. He'll be sentenced later this year. Well, our reporter Robert Murphy has been talking exclusively to Ieuan Llewellyn, who was sent there for 3 weeks in 1976.
I was an absolute sadistic nutcase.
Ieuan Llewellyn is not describing one of his fellow inmates from the 1970s Young Offenders Institute where he attended. He's talking about one of the guards. Patrick Devaney looked like a respectable old man when he appeared for his recent trial, but his past caught up with him half a century after his reign of terror. He worked in the gym in Eastwood Park in South Gloucestershire, which was then a Young Offenders Institute. Mr Llewellyn is the first of Devaney's victims to speak publicly of how he is still haunted by his time there.
When I look back with an old head and I look back, he was a cruel, no sense of, if there was a 14-year-old kid crying his eyes out, he'd be screaming at them. He's a very vicious man.
Mr Llewellyn was 15 when he was convicted of breaking into a cinema and theft from a club. He was sent to Eastwood Park for just 3 weeks in May 1976. He says Devaney was not the only prison officer who was violent, but he was the worst.
What was it about this one man that just set him apart from the others?
Well, I would say the use of weapons.
Mr Llewellyn said the worst moment followed an argument with Devaney over a tattoo.
And he punched me on the jaw. It's by the gate and in the gym. That's what I told in court, everything. And I went down on all fours, like a dog, you know. And then he booted me. Everybody would have saw it. I didn't think adults would ever hit children.
Patrick Devaney worked here at Eastwood Park at the time of a government policy which was known as the short, sharp shock. Tough discipline to discourage inmates from coming back. He told the court he never administered anything stronger than a clip round the ear, but despite that denial, a jury convicted him of misconduct in a public office, that he abused 22 14 to 17-year-olds. The court heard he ran a game called Murder Ball, that he racially abused young black children, that he pitted big boys against small boys in fights, and that he used weapons, including paddles and cricket bats.
Remember, he'd line us all up at the end for the people who cheated, and just, I think he called it a sixer, would just whack us on the backside.
Ieuan Llewellyn has gone on to run a successful publishing business, but he says everything in his life has been tainted by the trauma of those 3 weeks in 1976. He wonders if that will change when Devaney is sentenced later this year. Robert Murphy, ITV News.
Well, Rob joins us now in the studio. Rob, we heard from Ieuan there. That was a tough listen, just one of the victims, but his case, it could be just the tip of the iceberg.
That's right, he was one of the 22 victims as part of this case. But up to 13,000 boys went through Eastwood Park during this era. And we're talking about 14-year-old boys, low-level crimes, not violent children. And this coincided with this government policy of the short, sharp shock, this discouraging policy. But what investigators say is that what Devaney did went far beyond that policy.
This didn't mean carte blanche to assault children, and we must remember they were children who had committed lower end offences. They're spending 6 weeks in a youth detention centre, and they should have been rehabilitated. Instead, they were being bullied and brutalised by Patrick Devaney.
So this is the first prosecution of this type within the Avon and Somerset area, but it's not the first in the country. A few years ago, 5 guards were imprisoned for historic abuse up north. Patrick Devaney, he's due to be sentenced on the 11th of August.
Rob, thanks very much.